Alright, Xenosaga II. It's been several months between recording the first game and this one. I'm definitely still a Square Enix pleb, but let's see why this game was the only one worth porting over to Europe. We start off in a flashback 14 years before the events of the game. Recurring character Chaos from the first game and fellow Realian soldier Kanan fight in a conflict on Miltia, the planet that was supposedly lost shortly thereafter. They encounter Jin, the brother of Shion, and fight off Margulis from the U-TIC Organization. Back in the present time, after a quick recap of the events in Episode I, our gang is on their merry way to the second Miltia. Which, now that we're properly introduced to the place, it's really bizarre to me that this game has a concept of a second Miltia. You know, it's that one joke, oh you like Earth so much, then why isn't there an Earth 2? But in fact, in this game, there actually is an Earth 2, there's a planetary sequel. Now at second Miltia, the gang decides to finally analyze the data inside Momo and hand over kos-mos to the scientists for analysis. Shion obviously being reluctant to do so. This is also where characters get a bit more room to breathe and develop. Momo shows her desire to be more accepted by her creator, who she sees as a mother. Meanwhile, the mother finds it hard to accept a reality based on her deceased daughter. She talks with Ziggy about this, where Ziggy suggests that she should try seeing Momo as someone different than her deceased daughter. Ziggy has also become a bit of a father figure for Momo, partially relating to his own past. He also shows us a bit more of a hint as to his suicide being related to the death of his son, and him being opposed to the idea of renewing his parts/organs to extend his life. I wish we could see more of Ziggy's history here, but the game really doesn't do that much beyond this. There's an additional phone game called Pipe Piper that goes more into Ziggy's past, but considering this is a Japan exclusive, now unobtainable phone game, I'm just gonna hope that Xenosaga 3 gives me the development I'm looking for and it isn't relegated to a game that you really can't access anymore. Shion meets up with her brother Jin, and a family squabble almost immediately happens, Shion blaming their parents' deaths on his absence at the time. Shion also gets haunted by this ghost person asking her to save her sisters. Junior and Guinan get mentally tormented by Albedo, who's still plotting shit. And lastly, Chaos still doesn't do a damn thing this whole fucking game. Hey, I guess they can't all be winners. The decrypted data that Momo has the information to find the original Miltia again, which is necessary because that's the resting place of the original Zohar. As we get to decrypting Momo's data, Albedo finally shows his hand. After that oh so lovely magician's act in Episode 1, he basically implemented a virus into Momo and that virus just got activated. The gang travels into Momo's mind, twice actually for some reason, in order to stop the virus and retrieve the data. This is where we get some heavy character backstory on Guinan, Jr. and Albedo. The kids basically being creatures made to neutralize the energy of Udo. Before they attempt this though, it is revealed that Albedo, unlike the others, is the only one who can regenerate body parts at will. And he doesn't take it well when he finds out that he is the only one, the thought of immortality traumatizing him. And when the eventual attempt to neutralize Udo happens, Albedo's weakened mental state and Junior's own hesitance basically ended the experiment in failure, killing everyone except the three of them. Albedo being touched by the energy of Udo went insane, turning him into the lovable goofball we know him as today. Albedo confronts the group inside Momo's subconscious and succeeds in stealing the data. The data he stole in Episode 1 is data that he wasn't able to decrypt. I guess it was smart to put a backup plan in there by planting the virus inside of Momo, but I do find it very weird that he basically has to torture her again to simply get the WinRAR password equivalent for this shit. Finally having the data needed, Albedo unlocks the path to Miltia and the original Zohar, whilst dissolving in its energy. And that is where Disc 1 ends, and I want to talk more about the structure of this narrative, but I'll do so a bit later. Disc 2 is a surprisingly easy affair in comparison, focusing more on the goals instead of developing the characters. With the way to Zohar, the ultimate power, open, the Federation, the U-TIC, our heroes, and the Immigrant Fleet race to be the first to claim it. The Immigrant Fleet essentially being the true founders of the U-TIC, though that doesn't really mean much. kos-mos breaks out and rescues Shion from a space battle, and they just blow up the Immigrant Fleet's base of operations without a care in the world. Again, they don't really mean much. They reach Miltia, find out Momo's father caused the cataclysm as a self-defense against the Gnosis and Udo, beat Margulis up one more time, and find the Zohar. Okay, I know I've been skimming through the plot a bit, but I have to show the scene in full, because this scene is fucking amazing. Oh, there he goes. Holy fuck. The Matrix dodge. Are you fucking kidding? He caught the sword? Oh my fucking god, this is still going. I'm sorry, what? Why can't I do that in the actual battles? This is also where Shion finds the sisters the ghost was telling her to find. Them being basically held comatose to control the Zoar, and Shion emotionally asks Kos-mos to kill them. It is at this moment that the evil Pope shows up. He is someone who had been hinted at a couple times before, but here he reveals that he is the leader of the true government of it all, the Ormus. He decides to take the Zoar and then blows up the planet, including his own army? What the fuck? Why'd he do that? Anyway, remarkably being not dead, you go back into the planet, Albedo shows up, Albedo dies, you beat up the Pope, and then another group called the Testaments show up. They revive Albedo, piss off Ziggy because it probably has to do something with his son's death, and then they kill the Pope. How many secret Illuminati-like groups exist in this universe? Like, I think this is like the fourth one. Wait, no, it is the fourth one. We had the U-TIC, the Immigrant Fleet, the Ormus, and now we have a group called the Testaments. Each following up on the previous one. How is someone supposed to keep track of this shit? I get one conspiracy, maybe two, but 4 is stretching it a lot. I think most lasagna I've eaten has less layers than this fucking government conspiracy. The Pope is essentially also the final boss. After defeating him, the party leaves and rests up for a bit. I don't know why they leave Albedo with the power of God, because that seems like a really dumb idea. But it works out because Junior decides to leave and confront Albedo alone. And in the end, seemingly successfully killing him. Albedo ascends to heaven because apparently child torture and murder gets you an express ticket to the pearly gates. Junior returns and the gang almost retrieves the Zoar until a random ass ship swoops in, says nope, some vague bullshit about Chaos being a participant, and then the credits roll. I guess that's the end. During the credits we see hints that the characters have come to terms with some of their inner conflicts. Sibling relations restored by talking, or murder, and in a post-credits scene we see the Testaments welcoming a White Cloak member who I can only assume is Albedo. Yeah, okay, that story happened. I know that, like, developing a mystery and intrigue and adding more layers to the narrative is a natural evolution of storytelling, but this... I feel like there were so many loose threads that got started in the first game but now end up not getting resolved or being replaced by other story elements. Like, there's multiple factions and NPCs that I pretty much feel they're not gonna get any development in the third game either, and I just have to kind of accept that they're very much side characters. I guess that's okay. The biggest takeaway from this game's narrative is that Albedo is fucking dead, although maybe not really. The Zoar has been found and immediately stolen and the Testaments exist. I feel like Momo and Junior basically have their respective arcs ended at this point, and Shion's is probably only gonna up further when it comes to kos-mos. And kos-mos is still just a robot, really. I mentioned in my review of part 1 that she didn't amount to much, but here, my god, talk about a character with zero relevance in the story. And she's on the goddamn cover! As far as structure goes though, what the fuck happened with the pacing? The first disc, I'm pretty sure was half cutscene, if not mostly. I knew the game was short going in, but after having to do a reskin of a dungeon I'd already done, for the game to tell me I was about halfway was baffling to me. Things are better in the second disc as far as the balance between story and gameplay goes, except for this blurb at the beginning that I swear they abridged for the sake of making a deadline. There's a bunch of stuff here that they just mentioned, like, yeah, these things totally happen, man. Just trust us. And mind you, I don't mind cutscene heavy games. I love the Metal Gear Solid series, and that is nothing but massive cutscenes. But I do think that the pacing of it here isn't very good. Now, I wouldn't recommend this game anyway unless someone was invested in the story after playing Episode 1. So I guess it's a moot point, unless you're someone who wanted to play Episode 2 because of Episode 1's complex battle system. And if that's the case, yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But let's talk about what's similar first. You still explore surroundings and dungeons the same way as in Xenosaga 1, just with a lot more puzzles for items and side quests. Nothing too brain taxing though, just observational and interaction based mechanics. Battles are still turn-based with distinct enemies in the overworld. The ability to stock up on the amount of attacks you can make, and the use of the boost to cut ahead and the rotation of turns. There's some new stuff as well though, the newest additions in battles being the use of so-called double attacks, where you combine the attacks of two party members, and being able to switch party members for the use of a turn mid-battle. But the most important addition is that each attack hits a certain combat zone. In Episode 1, attacks had a certain element that characters could be weak against. That's still the case here, but there's a bigger focus on trying to find the proper combination of moves to break an enemy. After the enemy has been broken, you can then air or down an enemy, basically leaving them stunned and defenseless, ripe for blasting with other moves, which will now do very big amounts of damage. Whilst on the surface it seems like there's still some variety in strategy, in practice this turns into pretty much the same way of beating down enemies every single time. Enemies are incredibly vulnerable to being broken, so all those fancy spells and double moves, you're better off just sticking to breaking the enemies. Even for bosses this is the best strategy, since they develop nastier strategies as the fight goes on. You stock up on turns, chip away at the opponent, and when he gets serious, proceed to break the opponent, air or down them, and unleash all your stockpiled attacks and boosts. This is how you do big damage in Xenosaga 2, and this is what you'll do for pretty much every fight in the game. The combat zone mechanic isn't the only big change brought to the gameplay however. The developers apparently listened to fan feedback about the first episode being too complex. So in order to streamline the process, the devs tried to do away with the mechanics that were seen as unneeded. But they just may have got a tiny bit overboard with that. The AGWS, you know, the mechs you could customize and equip and summon for high damage, have basically been completely omitted. You still get mechs in the form of the ES, but only for scripted events, and these events and battles are really easy. There really isn't a lot of strategy needed for these sections, and because they're used so little, they kind of feel like glorified cutscenes to me. All those types of different experience you could get before have been brought down to normal leveling, C points and S points. C points are basically needed to access different categories of skills, essentially functioning as keys to open up those abilities. The dumb thing about C points though is that you'll get very few of them from battles, and only a couple through items. So if you want to get C points, you use them to open up a category of skills, acquire those skills with S points, and then get a C point bonus more than you initially invested after getting every skill. Essentially, you spend C points to spend S points to get C points again. That feels weird, doesn't it? S points are also gained from leveling in items and are used to unlock new skills. Skills range from passes, to active abilities you can equip, to enhancements of your character. As every character can learn every skill, the initial class and ether preference has been completely voided in favor of a blank slate starting point. Most skills are available right from the get-go, though some can require certain secret keys you can get through doing side quests or from treasures. But that's really where it ends. In summary, you open up skills with C points, and getting all the skills in one category gives you C points back. Skills can be gotten with S points, most skills are available from the start, and there's also basic level progression that raises stats all around. As you can see, this is a kind of clumsy way to handle things. Most skills being ready from the get-go makes it real easy to set up characters as desired early, and never having to develop them further, and C points are essentially meaningless, they're just keys. Now I propose, what if we ditched the system and only had experience and S points, and unlocking skills was tied to level progression? I think in any other game that would have resulted in a more natural character building aspect. You grow stronger, you get more abilities. Makes sense in theory. The problem is though that it feels like the game mostly just wants you to level up and use proper combos to hit enemies. Skills are certainly useful, but often more an enhancement of the base character you get through leveling anyway. The exception being healing and buff or debuff spells, which are pretty much essential like in most RPGs. That's not where the streamlining process ends though, because this game has also completely removed the concept of money and shops. There's a side quest where you can turn in items to decrease the depths, but aside from that, yeah, Jesus. And I initially wrote this down as a sort of footnote, that the game doesn't have a currency system to buy supplies, armor, or weaponry with. But the fact that the game just has no currency, no weapons, no armor, I'm actually, the more I think about it, absolutely stunned. I don't think there's any other RPG that I've ever played that completely got rid of its currency system. Even the easiest and oldest RPGs, Paper Mario, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, Dragon Quest I, fucking Ultima, have a currency system. But you know what doesn't? Quest 64. That's it. That's the only RPG I can think of that omits the currency system. And much like Xenosaga 2, the game is also very short for an RPG. Obviously, my argument here is a bit of a fallacy. Just because something is standard or tradition doesn't mean that omitting the feature is a bad idea, which is fair. However, I do think that if you're gonna strip mechanics, you should replace them with others that have their own depth. And sadly, much like Quest 64, the game doesn't really do that. I think the combat zone mechanic is all this game brings forth in terms of strategy. As someone who played Episode 1, the change is very jarring. I feel like I'm on autopilot for most of it. I certainly felt like the first game had some bloat and was perhaps a bit too difficult at times, but this feels like the exact opposite. Partially I wonder if this is because I got a bonus out of importing my Episode 1 save data, which gave me swimsuits with extra perks and extra skill points to unlock some stuff early. But I imagine most people wouldn't jump into Episode 2 without Episode 1 unless they're very curious. The initial plan was to make Xenosaga a 6-episode series. This was an idea that was also drafted for the original Xenogears, but that was rejected. And going from a story that was supposed to span 6 games to 3, I can imagine a lot of story beats were cut to make the story flow better for this trilogy. I imagine it's also why the start of Disc 2 just feels like a bunch of narration to quickly get us to the more interesting bit, because there's no reason this wouldn't be gameplay otherwise. In regards to taking a different approach than Episode 1, this was partially also because of the critical response the game got. The developers made sure to rework basically every aspect of the game for the next installment. One of the things they reworked was the way side quests were handled. Before, this was through the email system and by talking to NPCs. Now we have something called the Good Samaritan system. You still have to find the relevant NPCs, but now you can track progress or whether or not you passed or failed the side quest. This also gives you a good idea of how many side quests there are, though a chunk of them are beyond the post game and most are either busy work or border on the line of fucking annoying. Hey, could you go back and forth 8 different times just to finally find the NPC you were looking for? No, that doesn't sound fun at all. It says General White from Paper Mario had an even more annoying brother. But the rewards range from good healing items, more skills, or items that give you skill points. Doing them does give you a nice buffer for the somewhat harder boss fights later down the road. After beating the game, I didn't really bother with the post-game stuff. I hadn't really felt enthusiastic enough to keep playing it, and I would rather just move on to the next game. I did hear that Elder Kaiser makes his return there, but alas, perhaps we'll meet in Episode 3, my friend. As for the music, okay, from what I gather, the reception for the game's soundtrack wasn't as positive as it was for the first game, which is kind of baffling to me. As far as I'm aware, both games use an orchestra for the music during cutscenes. However, Episode 2 has fewer pieces. What it does have though is actual dungeon and town music. It's your generic electronic beeps and boops, stuff that's not intrusive to the ears and easy to listen to and repeat. Maybe not on the highest volume, but it's kind of like Bomberman hero music to compare to anything. The fact that there's dungeon music at all makes it so that this soundtrack completely eclipses the Xenosaga 1 soundtrack for me. Silence can be an effective tool to unnerve me, but for Xenosaga 1 to do it the whole game wasn't exactly a design choice I appreciated. But I looked around on some forums, and that opinion seems to be quite the unpopular one. I've seen so many posts about people who mention that they hate this soundtrack, and even some that mention that they prefer silence over the soundtrack in Episode 2, and I'm just sitting here like, really? I know music preference is super subjective, but you'd really rather have dead silence over this soundtrack. Are beeps and boobs that bad nowadays? I'm honestly just perplexed this being such a negative point towards the game. The visual style has also changed, mostly on the character designs. The overly anime cartoonish designs have been replaced with something more realistic, for as far as that's possible. I don't hate it too much. I think that Shion, for instance, looks much better, but kos-mos looks noticeably worse. I don't think it should distract anyone too much though, after they get used to it. And from what I heard, it's different again in Episode 3, so I guess I'll see how I like it then. Man, Episode 2. It's a weird one. Whereas the game does feel like a continuation of Episode 1, it also feels like an overreaction in terms of design based on critical feedback. Omitting and dumbing down numerous mechanics for the sake of streamlining, it's no wonder this game is as short as it is. And despite having a lot more side and post-game content, feeling a bit lacking. The overall experience felt very much like I was on autopilot for the entirety of it. However, despite my criticism, I still did enjoy my time with the game as a follow-up to Xenosaga Part 1. Perhaps because it doesn't require a lot to play, being able to turn off my brain and go through it made it very easy to jump in. There's an in-game soundtrack that, despite heavy criticism, I personally enjoyed, and certain characters are still interesting with development and ambitions. I've seen numerous posts exclaiming that this is pretty much the lowest point as far as the entire Xeno series goes. Even with my limited experience of 2 games so far, I'd agree, but only because I imagine the rest being more mechanically sound and having more depth. The game very much feels like an interlude as a way of bridging the gaps between Episode 1 and 3, I imagine. In the end, I don't find this a terrible game, and I think perhaps making the games more easy to digest was a smart idea, just poor execution in this case. It's very easy to start this game up as just start playing through it, especially after finishing Episode 1. I'd say it's approachable, but I can recommend starting with Episode 2 of a trilogy where the plot takes such a central stage, with requiring knowledge of the previous entry. I'd stay away from this game if you haven't played Episode 1, but if you have, you may as well play through Episode 2 as well. Is it good? Not really, but it doesn't require a lot from you, so you can breeze through it quickly and head into Episode 3. And I can only hope that my journey through Episode 3 will end off this trilogy in a good way.